Can suffering inspire? Like all of us, I've suffered loss, like the death of family members, friends, and relationships. Loss is a part of living. But can that living be, in some ways, enhanced and make our lives more fulfilled? The poet Catherine O'Meara recently wrote, "And the people stayed home and made art and learned new ways of being, and people healed. People found themselves." I recently heard a story on the radio about music composers who were inspired to create by different plagues, including the Black Plague of the 1300s. Let me be clear, I do not consider myself to be a great poet or musician. But I'm a good Sheldon, and at the very least, I get how deep pain, suffering, or anguish can bring out something positive for myself and perhaps for others. In my search to see where this first began for me, I've determined that it started back in about 1980. At that time, my maternal grandfather, my utter hero as a young boy, was within a year of passing on. Since I lived with my grandparents, watching his physical and emotional decline was essentially a daily activity. I was in college and working, so it was my grandmother who bore the burden of caretaker. I worked at Magic Mountain and enjoyed it immensely. However, while it was fun to be in the park all day, I would drive home into the dread of night. Waiting for me was my grandfather, despondent over his decline, and my grandmother, exhausted from managing it. I worked at the train ride, the Grand Centennial Excursion, an 1880s replica locomotive. It wasn't a coaster or water ride, the two dominant types of attractions. It was what amusement parks call a people mover. The guys I was assigned to work with weren't all that excited to be working on a people mover. On the other hand, I reveled in it. I liked the old-fashioned stuff. Black conductor's outfit looked cool, and I loved speaking into the mic, giving folks a tour. One night, while sitting on my grandparents' couch, I came up with a marketing idea to breathe enthusiasm into my fellow train operators. We became the Manly and Masculines of GCE, a lighthearted male bonding program filled with double entendres, rooted in history, and a sincere effort to promote employee unity and guest satisfaction. It also informed my existence for the rest of my 5 years working there, and my relationship with those guys, even 3 decades later. So, in a way, the specter of death seemed to prompt a creative escapism for me. Over 4 years later, in 1985, my grandmother took her life. Now, beyond the shock of her merely dying, having it be self-inflicted put me in touch with a numbing process I really didn't encounter with my grandfather. But somewhat similar to what followed in 1981 after my grandfather's passing, I went into an artistic escape, this time with a set of watercolor pencils, reinterpreting 3 Norman Rockwell illustrations in 3 months' time, 2 in color, something I had never done before, and not since. The painful coincidence of that moment was that those very pencils were a gift from my grandmother a decade before. The year 2008 began poorly for me, with my mother passing away in the first month of the year. Yet, it was also later the catalyst for me to try my first video chronology of somebody's life. It was appropriate that my mother was the first. Additionally, I drew my most colorful and largest picture since 1985, this time an interpretation of number 42, Jackie Robinson, inspired by the renowned artist Kadir Nelson. I gave the original to my dad and a copy to my son. 6 years later, in 2014, a different kind of loss, yet equally devastating: the dissolution of my marriage. It was a process that occurred over a period of years. So, by the time 2014 arrived, later that same year, I put together a video that was unlike any I had tried before. There were no moving or even still images. It was 5 minutes of black space, with my voice and Paul Bloom's haunting yet strikingly uplifting music. Change. I called it A Bridge in Black. This effort was a decided departure from how I had made videos in the past. It was the gateway video to an attempt to be more adventurous in my productions. 2016, the year of my father's passing. While he lived a long life of over 92 years, and we had spent the previous 30 or so years becoming closer and closer, I was still, in many ways, not ready. I was, of course, glad he was out of pain, and equally saddened by his physical absence. Yet, the resulting artistic outcome, in a manner of speaking, became what I consider to be the most complete video I've ever made up to that point, drawing from over 25 productions that came before it, in style, substance, and technique. As an aside, 2 years later, I made a SoundCloud audio track called On the Passing of a Loved One, which was, in part, inspired by the death of the matriarch of a family of dear friends, in part a culmination of learnings of deaths in my family, and finally, my effort to help others who find themselves in similar situations, even today. Now, in 2020, and like in 2014, this time, it's a suffering that is more abstract. I find myself, we find ourselves, in the throes of a global pandemic. I'm experiencing a dual set of circumstances, while the nature of my personal and professional life enables me to proceed with relative normality. My age, ethnicity, and genetic predispositions give me daily reasons for pause, and at times, feelings of mortality for myself and those who matter to me. While taking all reasonable steps to minimize my odds of contracting the virus, in a less abstract and more pointed way, I'm now grappling with having watched the abject brutalization of the spirit and ultimately the death of George Floyd by law enforcement. It wasn't the first time this has occurred in American history. No. Yet the rapid succession of recent events where African Americans, men and women both, have died at the hands of either law enforcement or individuals acting under the color of authority under dubious circumstances, made the murder of Floyd too overwhelming to manage. Enough is enough. I'm not alone, as thousands and thousands and thousands of individuals across the country and around the planet are apparently feeling the same. It's enough to put someone into an emotional tailspin, with the weight of it all too great to shoulder. I, too, for a brief period, had trouble finding my own words to speak of how my heart grieves, for myself and for my children. Nevertheless, decades of an inclination to seek an escape and channel my anguish through creative pursuits was not to be put asunder. It's what I've experienced and how I've responded to pain and despair over and over again. So, in the last few months, I've done personal audio recordings, one after another, wrote passage after passage, drawn picture after picture, and incorporated all of them into video after video, in an effort, conscious and unconscious, to help me and others cope. A direct result of my current uneasiness, and more broadly, an extension of 40 years of trying to make good out of what isn't good at all, on the inspiration of suffering.